All right, gang, another couple terms I want to bring out to you that are very, very important to us. And the terms are volitional and non-volitional. These are very, very important to us because I'm going to talk about this a lot, and it's important that you have a good understanding of what I'm referring to. So I want you to think about if I say, wave your hand, and someone waves their hand or I wave my hand. That's a voluntary type of function, okay? But non-voluntary or volitional in this case, I want you to think of as postural. Okay? So here's one of the classic examples that I like to use. If you say, hey, Dr. Hall, will you raise your right arm to 90 degrees of abduction? Okay. Now, work with me just for a second. If I raise my right arm to 90 degrees of abduction, which part of my brain was involved in elevating my right arm? You should think left, and you're absolutely correct. So the primary motor cortex for the cortical spinal pathway for voluntary movement originated from my left brain, frontal lobe, and fired down to my right arm. But something else very uniquely happened as well, is that my left brain also fired down to my left lumbar multifidi. So that when I raised my right arm, just before I engaged my deltoid to raise my right arm, my left brain fired down to contract the multifidi of my low back on the left side. In other words, ipsilateral. So that I could stabilize my lumbar spine in relation to the load of activity in my right arm. So think of it kind of this way, is that volitional is oftentimes contralateral, while non-volitional or postural is ipsilateral. Okay? So in other words, if I do something with my right arm, then my left brain engages that voluntarily. The left brain also fires down non-voluntarily to my spine to stabilize it. So what's very important about this is that stabilization should occur before the activity. All right? This is important. So have you ever had a patient come in who had a posterolateral disc herniation? I'm sure you have. We got a lot of these, right? So think about this. How did I get a left posterolateral disc herniation? Typically by bending over with my right arm and picking up my briefcase, the newspaper, a roll of toilet paper, or something. And see, now I bent to the right. What should have happened to my left side spine when I went to engage in activity with my right hand? So my left brain should have engaged my left multifidi to stabilize me before I do the activity. Okay? Now here's what's important about that. You have about 35% more neurological input when you do things in the coronal plane. Okay? So sagittal plane is very cerebellum, but coronal plane is very cortex. So see, from the coronal plane, cortex engages multifidi ipsilaterally when preparing a contralateral voluntary movement. Okay? So here's the big buzz for you. How do you best take care of your lumbar spine? Hint, not by doing lumbar spine exercises. In other words, doing back extensions doesn't really do squat for your lumbar multifidi. But if I want to have a healthy low back, I do things with my shoulders, right? See, people, when they don't use their upper body, or they have upper body weakness, is when they tend to develop lumbar instability. So the best way to have a healthy lumbar spine is by doing things with your arms, especially in a coronal plane. Running, jumping jacks if you want to, sidearm raises, rock climbing, right? Hiking, doing things that moves your arms, being a chiropractor, right? But if we just sit in a very sagittally dominant plane of motion all day, we don't get a lot of coronal plane movement. So if you want to have healthy coronal plane muscles, you have to do things in the coronal plane. Now, hear me carefully. How many of your patients have weak posterior delts and weak glute medians and constantly have tight hip flexors and tight pecs and the quote-unquote upper cross, lower cross syndromes? You see a whole bunch of this, right? So what I want you to focus on is the term volitional and non-volitional. So when you adjust patients, right, you activate their spinal muscles and the joints of the spine, but now you need to teach them activities to strengthen their spine and their proximal muscle groups. So later when I show you how to do some of these things, you'll understand why, okay? But we've got to hang on terminology, volitional and non-volitional. So if I'm not doing things side to side, and laterally if you will, then my dorsal lateral brain doesn't develop properly. So young kids who only do things right here will struggle with cognitive behaviors because they're not driving these pathways. So volitional and non-volitional. Non-volitional, more postural and ipsilateral. Volitional, more contralateral, okay? Good.